Hello, I'm Kevin Shuker and this is Health VOX. We're coming to you today from the Upper West Side from the restaurant Quintessence, one of New York's only organic, raw, living food restaurants, and we're here to attend a lecture by Mathew Grace. And get a load of the subject of this lecture if you want something exciting in your life, medical fraud and the great AIDS hoax. So sit back for some great information on Health VOX.
Okay, so we'll start with the basics. My name is Mathew Grace, and today I would like to present to you some astounding, shocking, frightening facts about what's called our healthcare system. As far as I'm concerned, there's not such a thing as a healthcare system in place in this country. We have disease management and drug salesmanship. It's very hard to hear what I'm about to say. I know a lot of you are open-minded people, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Keeping an open mind is one of the great gifts of life as we continue to grow. A lot of people I present this information to, and they absolutely cannot hear it. And I'm learning more and more why that's possible or why that's impossible. Nonetheless, a little background on me. I started off on this journey simply because I was an athlete. I was a former amateur boxer, and I wanted to perform better. After speaking to 10 or 12, 13, 20, 25 different experts on the subject, I found out that most people were confused and that there was really no knowledge that I'd come across in my common everyday experiences. So I went to the Library of Sciences on Fifth Avenue, and I've just spent hours and hours reading. And I came across the work of two people. One was a doctor. His name was John Tilden, and he wrote a book called Toxemia Explained. And then I began to read books by a man named Herbert Shelton. And I realized that most of the diseases and most of the difficulties that people had with their health had to do with poor feeding. And immediately as I was reading this, a man of 21 years old, who ate, meat and dairy products and, a lot of processed food, I realized that this made perfect sense. It just resounded in me. It struck a chord, and I decided this is something I'm going to do. And I began to do that, and it helped my athleticism tremendously. I recovered from workouts quicker. I was rarely sick anymore. Any allergies I had seemed to dissipate. My face looked different. My skin looked different. My clothes didn't smell as badly after a workout. A lot of things changed. My eyes got brighter. And when I stopped boxing, I really threw myself into the world of health and nutrition and tried to gain more and more understanding. And I realized from reading and from speaking to people that people had in fact gotten better from this condition called cancer, this mutation of cells. People had gotten better without any drugs. People had gotten better from leukemia. People had gotten better from asthma and all the, quote, incurable disease that modern medicine claims it to be. And that shocked me. And in my ignorance and from what little I had read or the amount of books that I read, I went and I spoke to people and I said, oh, you could get better. You could do... Albert Einstein said, great ideas are met with violent opposition by mediocre minds. And boy, I was just struck back with real violence from people who said, how dare you say such a thing? That's irresponsible. You don't know what you're speaking about, this and that. And I made it a point to find out what I was speaking about. So in 1981, there was a new disease, and we're going to be talking about this disease called AIDS as an example of how medical fraud is perpetrated on a population. Because it's not just AIDS, there's many, many other diseases that are foisted upon the unknowing public, and they're literally made up. And most people are being harmed not by the disease itself, but they're being harmed by the treatments. In fact, I'll say that it's very rare that somebody dies of cancer. In fact, most people die of cancer treatments. And if anybody has any doubt of the toxicity of cancer treatments, just look into it a little bit. Excuse me. I began to lecture after I couldn't hold this information that I knew to myself. I began to lecture and speak to people on street corners and in laundry rooms, and then I got a little more organized when I was told that there was this dread new disease known as AIDS and that people were dying from it. And I knew, given what was being told and what was being said to me, that we were being lied to. I knew it. First I knew it intuitively, and then I knew it as I continued to do the research and asked many of the questions that I'm going to be asking tonight, and many of the questions that I've posed to these doctors. Sure enough, I got the chance to work with people who had been diagnosed with what they called full-blown AIDS. They got well. I read a book by a doctor called Roger's Recovery from AIDS who got well with no drugs. I started a group called the Coalition for Health Re-Education. While I was giving these lectures and holding my group meetings, a man approached me who had a television show and asked if I would be a guest. I said, certainly, I would love to be a guest on your show. I'd love to tell as many people as possible about this so that they have a choice, so that they don't think the only way I can go is the medical route. And I hosted the show, and he asked me if I went on the show, and he asked me if I wanted to host it. And I said yes, and for 7 years, we had this program called Accent on Wellness on Saturday mornings, and we brought at least 10 people who were diagnosed with what they call AIDS who had gotten well without taking any drugs. And we had people on who had what they called herpes. We had people on with what they called arthritis and cancer and tumors, all who had gotten well. And I, in my naivete, thought that when you bring people like this, in a small cable market nonetheless, New York City, that I would get some feedback. I often invited doctors on the show. I wanted to debate doctors in person. I often invite doctors and experts and reporters to my lectures. And I say to them, if I'm saying something that is wrong, please let me know. It's a great responsibility to speak to people as somewhat of an expert and say the wrong thing. So this show I hosted for years, and I continue to see anybody who abides by the laws of nature, our biological laws, return themselves to wellness. Now, there's a lot more involved in just that, and this isn't what this lecture is about so much. It is about how medical fraud is perpetrated on the unknowing public, and we're going to use AIDS as an example. By the way, there is a question and answer period, and that's always my favorite part of the lecture. I get to use my ears instead of my mouth. And if you have any question, please write it down. Please play devil's advocate with me. There's no question I want to avoid. Okay, so let's begin. I would like to begin by telling or repeating what we know about AIDS. These are all things that we've been told. We've been told that AIDS is fatal, that AIDS is incurable, as of 1981, that it's new, it's a syndrome, it's mysterious, it's sexually transmitted, it's an epidemic, we all know that. AIDS is caused by a virus called HIV. If anything I'm saying is incorrect, you can shout out. There are millions of people in Africa with AIDS and HIV. Early intervention with AZT is helpful. HIV is a new virus as of 1981. Everyone should be tested, right? We're told that constantly. The HIV test is accurate and dependable, and T-cell counts are indicative of a healthy immune system. This is what we're being told. This is the daily media message that's being pounded and pounded in our direction. By the end of this lecture, you might think that all of these things might be incorrect. Okay. In 1981, there was a new method of testing that people from the Centers for Disease Control were interested in. They tested people's CD4 cells. CD4 cells are a big part of the immune system that helps to clean the body out, attack invaders, and get rid of their poisons. We've been told with this new disease that if your T cells are below 400, that you're ill. What doctors and what most people in the media and most people in general don't understand is that T cell counts are absolutely not an indicator of health. However, they wanted to say that it was, and I'm going to get into that more. There are people that have had T cell counts of 90 that are in perfect physical condition. What people need to understand is that T cells occur in accordance with how toxic your body is. And then there's the other side of this, which is this. Let's say my body is completely clean and non-toxic. I don't need many T cells. My body won't produce many. If I continue to poison my body and poison my body, my T cells will go up. And if I continue to poison my body, eventually T cells start to drop. So a low T cell count could mean two things. It could mean that your body's very clean, or that your body is very toxic and has been for quite some time. So they had this technology, and there was a Dr. Gottlieb out in UCLA University that was using this new technology to test for people's T cell counts, and he found 4 people that were immune depressant. And at that time, around 1980, Centers for Disease Control's funding was being cut. Ronald Reagan was cutting their funding, and they needed something new to perpetrate on the public. So James Curran, who was the head of CDC at the time, and a whole bunch of them, decided that they would try to find as many people that were, quote, immune deficient as possible according to these CD4 cell counts. So everybody went out looking for people, whereas before they would have just said, oh, this guy's a drug user, because the first 50 people that they claimed had AIDS were intravenous drug users. And instead of saying it's the heroin that they're injecting in their veins, they said it's something that's being transmitted through the needles. Okay? So the symptoms of this, quote, new disease and this panic, and everybody remembers what it was like, spread across the front page news, and absolutely the lead story on most newscasts, this new strange disease. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. There was, at that time, and I looked in the Merck manual, that is the history of disease. Every disease that's ever been listed since 1536 is listed in the Merck manual. I found at least a minimum of 15 diseases that matched the exact same symptoms they were talking about. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, severe combined acquired immune deficiency syndrome, a lymphocytis, a gamma globule anemia, thymic lymphoplasma, DeGeorge syndrome, Kaposi sarcoma, granulocytopenia, all of these. I took the symptoms and I listed them, and I listed what they called this new frightening disease. It was the same thing. I said, what are these people talking about? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't new. And then in 1984, a man named Robert Gallo came to the microphone and said these exact words. The probable cause of AIDS has been found. The probable cause. And he claimed it was a virus called HIV. He said it was new. Now, this is a man who spent 40 years. First of all, he was convicted of medical improprieties on 2 or 3 different counts before this announcement. But he told the public that the probable cause had been found of AIDS. And as far as I can tell, after offering a $110,000 reward for 7 years on my program, and today, and to anybody out there who's listening to this, I offer a $100,000 reward for anybody who could show me one piece of scientific evidence that proves that HIV causes AIDS. There's been over 100,000 papers written on HIV. Not one of them shows that HIV causes AIDS. Yet you have this whole, quote, epidemic. And we're going to look into the numbers and see that it's not quite an epidemic later. So he makes this announcement, and all of a sudden, panic goes out. And for the first time in history, you have a right-wing Republican virus that goes after gay men. 99% of the people who were diagnosed with this dread disease were gay men. Again, nobody looked at their lifestyle, and I'll tell you this, as it's in my book, and it's what I've been preaching for so long, wherever you find disease, you will find poisoning, period. So he makes this announcement, and he claims that HIV is a new virus. And there's a guy named Anthony Morris from the FDA who says, what are you talking about? I find this virus in blood 50 years old. Anthony Morris is fired. He's told to shut up. He doesn't. And then he's fired from his position. It goes on. There's a man named Dr. Peter Duesberg. He is one of the premier microbiologists in the world. He was given a grant to do a study on the HIV virus. Duesberg is a Nobel laureate, one of the most revered and respected scientists, molecular scientists in the world. He came back and said, not only does HIV not cause AIDS, it doesn't cause anything. I'll prove it to you. I'll inject myself with it. And Dr. Duesberg and Gallo were actually friends at the time, not so much anymore. Immediately, this man who had served medicine for 2.5 decades, was banished. His funding was cut. And all of a sudden, he's hanging out there in the wind. But now, there's a group called the Group for the Scientific Reappraisal of the HIV/AIDS Hypothesis, filled with over 400 doctors that claim that HIV is not and cannot be the cause of AIDS. So you have now this group of old symptoms renamed as a new entity, and you have a supposed causative agent that's never been proven to be a causative agent. And now you have the testing, right? Anybody and everybody could feel for somebody who has been told that you have HIV, because at first, when you had HIV, your life expectancy was 1 to 2 years, according to the experts. So it's a death sentence. So you would think that there would be no question about the veracity of the testing. And here's what we find. First of all, when vaccines are given, they're given to artificially instigate the body to produce antibodies. On the principle that if the body has antibodies, you are safe from the invading virus, right? That's the principle. And now, with the so-called new virus, which isn't new, they say that if you have the antibodies, you're sick. And I remember being at the Hilton Hotel while there was an education seminar going on with about 10, 15 doctors, and there was a forum with the public, and I got up and I asked this team of doctors, I said, please tell me, how is this possible that you say that if I have the antibody to an invading virus, I'm safe, and that's the premise that you vaccinate on. Now you're saying that if I have the antibody, I'm sick. And I waited, and people kind of struggled for an answer, and you couldn't get a clear answer because that just doesn't make sense. You can't have it both ways. It gets worse. There are two different tests for what they call HIV. One is the ELISA test, and one is the Western blot test. Admittedly, by modern medicine and the health officials, the ELISA test is inaccurate. It's just used as, quote, a screening test. And if you take that test, you're directed to take the Western blot test. And you would think that the Western blot test would work. Well, there's a woman and her team of doctors in Australia. Her name is Eleni Eliopoulos. And she had about 12, 13 other physicians and experts working on this test. And she found that the test is 99% inaccurate. What they're testing for, again, is not the virus. There's no such thing as an HIV test. There's an antibody test, and they claim that if you have antibodies, they will react with the certain test that they give you. And these antigens that are supposedly specific to HIV are not specific to HIV. So that if you've had a flu, you could show up HIV positive. If you've had a flu shot, you could show up HIV positive. If you've been pregnant, you could show up HIV positive. So there's all this confusion. Then I realized that there was a third possibility for the outcome of an HIV test. There's positive and there's negative. You would figure that's it. There's something called indeterminate that nobody knew about. And even the patients won't know about. Just doctors know about indeterminate tests.